and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, Chair of the Editorial Board, Frank Gavin, sits down with Fred Logevall and Danny Bessner, authors of Recentering the United States in the Historiography of American Foreign Relations, which appeared in the spring 2020 issue of TNSR. This article discusses a trend in the academic history community, which may strike some of our listeners or readers as a bit unusual. After all, one of our goals is to avoid inside baseball. And yet, as the discussion shows, the trend within academic history to try to seek explanations other than the role of the United States for major events in the world has had the perverse effect of sometimes both underplaying the role of the United States in things that is good, and also overstating the degree to which the United States may be responsible for negative developments in world history. In this wide-ranging interview, Frank and Logevall and Bessner discuss the process of working on the article, the movements in history to which they are responding, as well as the response that they've seen to the article. Let's listen in on this discussion.
Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, which is the podcast for Texas National Security Review. I am Frank Gavin. This is literally the first one of these I've ever hosted, so if anything goes wrong, I've retained legal counsel. I usually associate podcasts with getting really, really drunk with Ryan and having things that I regret saying being recorded and spread out over to the world and never actually listening to them. So this will be a first for me. So actually really, really happy to have our two guests here today. The idea of this podcast is to discuss with some of the distinguished authors that we've published in our recent issue and learn a little bit more about the ideas behind the article and a little bit about them and their career. And today we have Danny Bessner and Fred Logevall, and we're going to be talking about their piece, which I absolutely loved and have tons and tons of things that I want to ask them about, called Recentering the United States in the Historiography of American Foreign Relations. And it was in the most recent Texas National Security Review, spring 2020, which you can get online. So welcome, Danny and Fred. And I've been told that the best thing to do is to have both of you introduce yourself. So Danny, why don't we start with you? Sure. It's okay that I call you Danny. I hear you. I see it came up as Danny. I didn't know if that was formally.
No, it's totally fine. Please call me Danny. That is perfect. So just to briefly introduce myself, I'm the Pyle Associate Professor in American Foreign Policy in the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. So actually not in a formal history department, though we do have a plurality of historians. And I've written one book called Democracy in Exile, Hans Speyer and the Rise of the Defense Intellectual, which came out with Cornell in 2018, and co-edited another book with Nicolas Guillot, who recently associated with the European University Institute in the EUI in Florence, called The Decisionist Imagination, Sovereignty, Social Science, and Democracy in the 20th Century.
Terrific. The Hans Speyer book is terrific. Highly recommended to our audience. Fred, you and I, we've known each other, what now, 60, 70 years?
We go back half a century at least, I would say, Frank. Actually, you were not even alive then, I was. So my name is Fred Logevall, and just delighted to be with all of you. I teach at Harvard, where I have a joint appointment in the Kennedy School and in the history department. Before coming here, I taught at Cornell, and I started my career at UC Santa Barbara. And even way back then, Frank and I were together on numerous occasions. I have a book coming out in September. It's the first volume of a 2-volume Life and Times biography of John F. Kennedy. And may I just say that working with Danny on this piece has been just a pleasure from start to finish.
Well, that's great. I want to get into that. Why don't you I would love to hear more about the origins of the piece for both of you. What got you thinking about this and how the article and the argument came together, and whether you came to it separately, whether it was a conversation, and then sort of how it developed over time?
Yeah, let me say just a little bit about the context, and then maybe Danny can talk a bit more about the specifics. But Danny came to Cornell as a postdoc. This would have been, I think, in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And we got to know each other there. I was basically the person who was responsible for, or his advisor while he was the postdoc. And we got to talking about what we saw in terms of the developments in the field as historians of U.S. foreign relations. What did we like? What did we not like? And came to, I think, see that we shared reservations about some of the developments that we saw. As important as much of the work it was and is, we thought that there was something missing, something that we wanted to address, and that's how this began.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I just want to say it was also wonderful working with Fred. So the conversation for this specific piece started at Cornell, as Fred just said. But for me, it also emerged because I was in the middle of turning my dissertation into a book when I came to Cornell. It was the 2013-14 academic year. And as I was revising, I really wanted to explore what I imagined to be a robust literature on the history of the national security state. Because my first book is actually a transatlantic intellectual history that examines how an exile from the Nazis, this guy named Hans Speyer, helped create the Rand Corporation. And I expected to be able to intervene in this big, robust literature on the development of the national security state in the 40s and the 50s and beyond. And of course, there's Mike Hogan's book, there's Aaron Friedberg's book, and there's associated books that touch on related issues, but there wasn't really the robust state-making literature that I expected to be in our field. There was connected literatures in the subfield of American political development, which has been historically more connected to business history. People like Mark Wilson actually work on similar issues, but I was just surprised that within the field of foreign relations history proper, there wasn't this big history on the national security state, which is obviously such an important mechanism of projecting and creating American power in the world. And it was that lacuna that actually started to get me thinking about the sort of the limits of the international and transnational turns, which I was explicitly trained in. I went to college. I entered college in 2002 at Columbia. I did my graduate work at Duke starting in 2007. And really the sort of de rigueur assumption, at least at those institutions, was that you'd adopt a transnational or international lens. You'd learn another language, you'd work mostly in foreign archives, and that this was a signal of professional prestige and really a sign of importance of your scholarship. And so I was very much trained in that. And then as I sort of got into revising my book, I started to notice some limits of the approach. And that's really, I think, how the initial conversation between Fred and I started, especially because Fred, as you'll recall, you had just won the Pulitzer for very much an international history. So that for Embers of War. So that I always assumed that sort of the limits also came out of your own work, but I'm not sure if that's actually the case.
One thing I've wanted to ask you, Danny, is because you mentioned this, and maybe we can talk about this later because I do want to get to the piece, but I've always wondered if you thought yourself more of an intellectual historian or a historian of American foreign relations. And when I read the piece, I was trying to put together your background and interest in intellectual history, of which has both domestic and obvious transnational components to it. And so I was wondering how does that part fit in at all?
Absolutely. So ironically, my major field was in European history. And it was my second field that was in international history. So I was formally trained as a European intellectual historian. My advisor's big book is on Karl Popper, a philosopher of science. But I consider myself to be an intellectual history of U.S. foreign policy. And it's funny that you asked that because I'm now writing a article for the journal Modern Intellectual History, which is essentially a review of the intellectual history of U.S. foreign policy. So I think in the last 25, 30 years, there's been a tension within the field between what I call ideological history of the Mike Hunt, the Arne Westad project, where you examine these big ideological formations like racism and then examine how that influences U.S. foreign policy. But I think members of my generation, people like Steve Wertheim, Amy Offner, Chris McKnight-Nichols, have adopted a more traditional intellectual history approach, really going into the fine-grained history of ideas and see how they shape U.S. foreign relations. And I imagine that this is primarily because of the influence of neoconservatives during the Iraq War, a very self-conscious intellectual movement, which was very aware of its own intellectual genealogy and considered themselves to be intellectuals, was so influential in American foreign policymaking that I imagine when we look back on it, it spurred a lot of people of sort of the millennial and slightly older generation to explore these intellectual issues.
All right. I had to be careful not to go down this path because Bruce Kuklick was one of my advisors. And so I immediately think of the parallels both in your book and to the obvious importance or impact that people in Rand and universities had in the early Cold War, thinking about these things. But before getting, one thing I did want to ask is, I hang around with a lot of political scientists and they co-author a lot. Historians don't do that very much. I have to confess that I find it, it's sort of when people say that you're going to have a second child and there'll be economies to scale, and it's actually the opposite. It's an inverse economy to scale. I've often found that sometimes to be the case with co-authoring, and a lot of historians don't do it. But I and that's what's so admirable about, I think, this effort. And Fred, you've got the terrific effort that you did with Campbell Craig as well. I wonder if you could, before we get into the meat of the piece, talk a little bit about your experience and if there are lessons there, particularly for younger historians thinking about.
I mean, I think it's such a good point, Frank. And I think we as historians should do way more co-authoring than we do, frankly. We're all trained, as you know, to do this in a solitary way. And I do think it's important, obviously, for a dissertation and for a first book and so on to be doing it solo. But I just think it has all kinds of benefits. And you mentioned the book with Campbell Craig, which I think is worth mentioning also in the context in terms of the setup for this article, because Campbell and I concluded in that book, which was published in 2009, we're going to have a new edition that's coming out this summer, although substantially the same book. But we concluded that, international history, for all of its wonderful features, can introduce a narrowness of its own, which is something that Danny and I also basically say in this piece. And that for us, for Campbell and for me, the domestic politics of foreign policy, what we call the intermestic, and the importance of decision-making in the Cold War by the United States, strangely enough, hadn't been given the kind of close treatment, at least in recent historiography, that we thought it should have. And so that's how that book resulted. But just to reiterate the point, I think co-authoring is something we should do more of. I think that the canvas on which we work, let's say it's the Cold War, I don't care how good you are as a historian, how good your languages are as a historian. There is just so much to cover, so much to do, that co-authoring can make great sense. I think you're right to, it's certainly true, Frank, that you don't do 50% of the work when you co-author. You both do 75% of the work. So I think how it tends to work out. But I think that Danny and I would not have written the same piece if we were working individually. I think we would not have finished as quickly. Danny, I don't mind saying, took the lead in terms of drafting. We talked a lot about architecture and the scaffolding, but I heartily endorse the notion, even if there are frustrations whenever you collaborate with somebody. Would you agree, Danny?
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly. And for me, it's just a way to really have like a scholarly dialogue. I definitely think the piece was stronger by having disagreements and coming to conclusions and admitting where I was wrong, or really feeling strongly about a particular issue. And it's just difficult to get that type of engagement, at least in my experience, outside of graduate school, when you're in a cloistered academic community. And so I found it really, really worthwhile and helpful to discuss ideas with Fred. And Fred, I think you're being I think like I took the lead on the intellectual history section, you took the lead on the Vietnam section, and then we really worked out the intro and conclusion in dialogue. Even if I might have drafted the first one, I mean, it's really it was a mutually constitutive process, and I think it was really helpful. And I also really enjoy co-authoring. And actually, I would say my most influential pieces, which are probably this piece and the piece I wrote for IS with Nicolas Guillotot, I mean, they're co-authored. And I think that's because you're able to bring different knowledges and different perspectival approaches to bear on a singular problem. And I think in history, we need to do it much more frequently. And in fact, I'm a big fan, and maybe I'm just reacting to the postmodern turn, where postmodernists argue that you shouldn't have master narratives. I think synthetic master narratives are actually really important for the historical profession itself to produce, because if we don't produce it, other people will. And I think that that sort of project would necessarily benefit from a multi-authored approach. And I think that we should be thinking as a field within Schaefer much more coherently about how to promote multi-authored volumes, single volumes in the future.
I can't help but ask, I mean, you dropped a real bomb in there, the idea that we should have synthetic master narratives in the field. I was going to ask the question, why did you anticipate the response to this piece that you got, and did you expect it to be that controversial? But clearly you must have, if that was your intent. So say a little more about that, because what do you mean by a synthetic narrative for the field? And maybe, I mean, when you say that, I think about, obviously you spend a lot of time looking at the origins of the international relations field, and they certainly have their synthetic narratives. And I can imagine where that has been an advantage and a disadvantage. Maybe you could say a little more about that.
So I think as a field, we don't really have a grand narrative of the direction of U.S. foreign relations history. The closest probably is George Herring's From Colony to Superpower, which is, a magisterial work that really presents a singular narrative of American foreign relations history from the revolution to today. But I think as a field, we're not inclined to produce those types of works because we are focused on contingency, we're focused on specific historical events, what have you. But I do believe that one of the things that emerged, to me at least, from the Trump administration and Trump's election, and also the recent discord over the 1619 project at the New York Times, is that these synthetic narratives have a really important function to play in society, an educational function. And they'll, of course, change over time. I think the postmodern critique is correct, the post-structural critique is correct, that knowledge can never really exist outside of its own historical moment. But that doesn't mean that we can't produce the types of narratives that speak to our historical moment. So I think one of the things that could come out in the future, now that we've taken what both Fred and I believe are very important international and transnational turns in the 90s by a reinvigorated domestic history of the United States, we could examine how the various levels of U.S. foreign relations history, whether it's the domestic, the international, the transnational, the supranational, or the global, interact at various points in time, and then highlight in the writing of a synthetic narrative which area of inquiry is most important for explaining the direction of American foreign relations history. So to my mind, that would have two benefits. One would be educational by showing the American public what we as a field think the history of U.S. foreign relations is really about, what professional scholars think about that. And then also it could, in an ideal world, provide a guidepost for action for policymakers themselves. If they receive a narrative about U.S. foreign relations history in the past and up to the present, they could perhaps chart out a new, what I would like to see at least as a new direction for the U.S. role in the world in the future.
To follow up on that, is your critique the absence of sort of synthetic narratives or that kind of thinking in the field, or is it the wrong synthetic narrative? Are you saying that there are competing synthetic narratives, and you're suggesting that people have just gotten the wrong narrative, or that there's an inclination in the discipline of history in recent memory to not develop or construct any synthetic narrative? So I guess at the end, are you looking for a singular narrative, competing narratives, or replacing a narrative?
My sense is the latter, that there's been a reticence, particularly since the post-linguistic turn critique, in the sense that language constructs reality, to produce a grand narrative. I think there necessarily would be competing narratives. As we all know, historians of foreign relations disagree about a lot of things, but I don't think there's even been a real attempt to produce the type of synthetic narrative of which I'm talking about. I don't know, Fred, you agree or disagree?
Well, maybe we differ slightly on this. I think broadly speaking, I would frame it in the same way. I do think there are pretty sizable number of master narratives produced in the profession at large. My colleague Jill Lepore, in a big book called These Truths, which is a marvelous book in many ways, did this, and of course it has a foreign relations and foreign policy dimension to it, as it must. You're probably right, though, Danny, in terms of what we might call U.S. and the world. If we talk about that as the particular subfield in this moment, that we've been reticent as a field to have these. You mentioned George's book, Walt Lefebvre, my former colleague, has a marvelous book called The American Age, which I think tries to do the same kind of thing. Of course, it's also the case that this is not the sort of thing that somebody does as a graduate student. So you either have tenure or you're at least beyond a first book when you try a kind of master narrative. Maybe that's as it should be, but yeah, no, I think you're correct, Danny, in your overall assessment. I share that view.
Well, let me follow up with you on that, Fred, because when I started, and you had probably started a few years before me, there were, you think of someone like Gaddis or Mel Leffler, who certainly self-consciously were trying to create a synthetic narrative and generated an enormous pushback from people like Bruce Cummings, from Anders Stephenson, from a whole variety of people. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out, my guess is that you're not saying, oh, let's all go back to post-revisionism or let's all go back to the sort of early mid-90s. I'm just trying to figure out where those efforts fit in with what you're suggesting. Yeah, no,
you bring up really important figures in our field. They remain important figures in our field, and they're producing these works. And we should add their books to Herring and to Lefebvre. And I'd have to think a little bit more about this. I don't know if you or Danny have a further thought on this. I suspect we're not, at least at this moment in time, as inclined, those of us who are now sort of in mid-career, in the middle of our careers in this particular field, to produce those kinds of works, which is an interesting comment in and of itself. Although we could point to Daniel Immerwahr's recent book as an attempt, in a way, to produce that kind of larger work. But I think we've been conditioned or we're inclined, I think, as a subfield to work on a smaller canvas. Most of us these days, we're trained to do that. And I think we tend to do that maybe more than we should, which I think is Danny's point. I don't know. What would you say?
I would agree. And I would also just add to that. I think why, for example, the revisionists produced a synthetic narrative and the post-revisionists produced a synthetic narrative is that there was more of a faith, and I don't think there's a better word for it, in IR theory. So the post-revisionists are very informed by structural realism and classical realism, and the revisionists are very much informed by Marxist theories of imperialism. And I think that there's been a general turn away. I've noticed, at least in my own career, which is obviously shorter, but I do think there's been a general turn away from theory in the last 15, 20 years, and a return, what I refer to as a return to the archive, not a return to sort of naive empiricism, von Ranke, wie es erkenntlich gewesen type of approach, but also closer to that than theory. For example, if you look at works written 20 years ago, oftentimes they'll mention Foucault in the introduction, right? Very, very few scholars of my generation are producing works with explicit theoretical discussions in the introductions to their work. And I think that turn away from synthetic narrative is reflective of the turn away from, or the skepticism of, social science in the last 20 years, which I think has been increasingly viewed as naive amongst historians, more naive than people did in the 80s and the 90s and the 70s as well.
So that's interesting, because it just seems a bit different than assigning the cultural turn for it, because the cultural turn, one would imagine it was an enormous emphasis on theories. And what you're describing is both smaller topics, lack of synthesis, and an absence of theory, again, I'm trying to make sense of what this is and how it happened. Does that make sense? I mean, if it was all the cultural turn, then we would expect that these dissertations and books would be loaded down with theory. And you're suggesting that the opposite has happened.
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty simple explanation, in the sense that the insights of the cultural turn have become such a mainstream part of the field that you don't need to really discuss them as unique. When you're writing in the very early 1990s and you're, arguing that classification is a form of disciplinary power, I think you have to justify that in a sense. But people who were trained I'm totally trained in the post-cultural turn, post-linguistic turn academy. That's just obvious. And I would actually say, and I'm curious to hear what you think, I don't think there's been a very influential theoretical movement on the field of history, broadly speaking, and particularly foreign relations history more specifically.
But here's, I guess, where I'm a little confused, gentlemen. And maybe this is a question that I would pose to you, Danny. I don't see the necessary disconnect between theory or the connection between theory and master narrative. If I understood you correctly, you were saying that because we tend to be less theoretical in our work, it means we're going to have fewer master narratives. I would have maybe argued the opposite, that if your emphasis is on producing a master narrative of whatever the subfield, you're maybe less likely to be theoretical. I've lost something in there.
So this is my sense. Let's say you're influenced by realism and you essentially believe, because I do believe there's a leap of faith there, that states seek security, right? You could use that idea as a way to organize the master narrative of American foreign relations history from the founding forward. Or let's say you're a Marxist and you think that states expand in order to either meet the interests of the capitalist class or provide access to raw materials. You could use that as a lodestone by which to organize your grand approach to American foreign relations history. But if you're skeptical, if you're more focused on contingency and you're less willing to essentially take that leap, then you're less likely to produce a synthetic narrative because it's more difficult to organize your analysis of American foreign relations history. And I would say the international and transnational turns are more about emphasis than they are about theoretical insight. It's more about who you're examining and what you're examining, as opposed to providing a particular lodestone through which to organize your intellectual work. Does that make sense?
It does, and I don't mean to, take the discussion in a new direction.
No, this is good.
If we come back to George's book again, to George Herring's book, I think he succeeds in many respects admirably well in producing over a very long book, probably 1,000 pages or more. I think producing a coherent narrative filled with contingency, filled with moments when presidents and their aides could have taken a different course than they took. There is a certain coherence, I think, to the narrative, and yet I'm not sure that George Herring is particularly theoretical in his outlook. But could be an exception that proves the rule. I think much of what you just said makes good sense.
Very quickly, I would say Herring's narrative is slightly informed by an emphasis on security. I think that's what's driving through the entire thing, even though he includes insights from other theoretical approaches. But I think you're right.
So this is an interesting conversation, because the way I read your article, it's actually not about us either creating a synthetic narrative, master narrative, or a general theoretical approach. It's about locating agency, right, which has theoretical implications. But you're basically saying that here's where the action is. And so, if you want to understand outcomes in the world, regardless of your theoretical approach, the agents of causality that matter are being overlooked without any presumption necessarily about why they're acting the way they are. Would that be correct? Because my guess is that you two might actually have different views as to why the actors are acting the way they are. Would that guess be correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think maybe I'm not sure. I think we see things more or less the same way here. But I think what I would say is that we want to suggest in this article that power matters. That, of course, we as historians need to pay attention to the marginalized, to the subaltern, to the excluded. We need to, I think, affirm, and Danny and I do affirm, that it's as important to study the marginalized and the subaltern and those with less influence as it is studying those in power. But we also need to study where decisions are made. We need to locate that. And I think that maybe this is controversial, but I do think in the profession as a whole, and Frank, you and I have talked about this before many times, I think there is a a suspicion of power and a suspicion of studying closely those who hold power. I think there's a sense that if you study armed conflict, and by the way, there's a pretty close connection between some of the things we're discussing today and the subfield of military history, and we could go there if you guys want to. But I think there's a suspicion, a sense that if you study armed conflict, or as Danny and I do in this piece, the projection of American power in the international system after 1945, somehow you're condoning it, or somehow you are an apologist for that power. I think we got a little bit of a sense of that, even maybe in the H. Diplo responses to the piece.
Believe me, I will get to the responses. As long as we're being controversial, having spent a lot of time with political scientists and in a political science department, they refer to this as the so what question. And maybe in more polite society, it's the sort of what matters question. And I think that this is a question that even someone like Michael Howard, who looked at War and Peace, basically in his Lessons of History, says, well, you can't choose. All history matters. And so I guess I want to put you both on the spot, because it's too easy to say we should study everything, particularly in a period of declining resources being committed to the study of history. And there are decisions a discipline makes, a field makes, universities make. They have a variety of factors, but you and Danny are sort of asked to figure this out. You're putting together your 20-person history department. And how do you do it? And to what extent does this so what or what matters question comes up? And how do you deal with it? How do you handle it?
So what I would say is that it's difficult to make prescriptive judgments about that, because everybody has different political projects. So necessarily how you're going to answer that question is going to depend on your own political project. And I'm firmly of the belief that not everything that historians study needs to be a causal story. There are projects of recovery, recovering things that could have happened in the past but didn't, and then using those for present political purposes. There are projects that want to highlight the agency of peoples who have been traditionally overlooked, in order to say that, they actually didn't interact in the world in a different way than we had presupposed. So I think everyone is going to answer that differently because of their own subjective experience. And let's be a little controversial here. One of the reasons that I was motivated to write this piece is that I think there was an assumption in the field that to examine a local agency was to be in some meaningful way politically left. And I actually think that isn't necessarily the case. For me, as someone who is very much interested in changing the future of the U.S. role in the world in a more restraint-oriented direction, one of the ways that that'll be accomplished is by actually understanding how American power works in the domestic context. So what I actually wanted to do as a professional historian, if I could relate my professional historical work to my own politics, is to actually understand how power works in the United States with an effort to change it. So what I wanted to do in the piece, particularly in that section where I historicize the international and transnational turns, is actually underline the irony that something that's imagined to be politically left actually had very quote unquote neoliberal origins. And we could talk about neoliberalism, whether that's a useful term. I think it is, but not everyone agrees. But I think that the impulse actually emerged, at least partially, from this very pro-capitalist globalization moment in the 1990s. So I wanted to denormalize and demystify the assumption between local agency and political leftness, for lack of a better phrase.
So I like, Frank, your suggestion. I like this picture. Suppose you're creating a history department of 20 people, and you've got a globe, you've got a human history to try to cover. And you've got a globe to try to cover. What do you do? And I think it's a very interesting way to think about this. And I guess one way to think about what Danny and I tried to do here is, and we have some of this data in the piece, when you think about the American colossus in world affairs after 1941, but certainly after 1945, and you think about the fact that the United States, it had special forces. I think in 2017, there was U.S. special forces in 149 countries. You think about the military deployments over the last 75 years, which are basically constant, the wars that have taken place over the last 75 years, one would maybe think that in a history department, not just of 20 people, but let's say 40 people, 60 people, 80 people, you would have one or maybe even two people whose primary concern, maybe not their sole concern, but who are certainly involved in teaching and doing research on U.S. foreign policy and on the making of U.S. foreign policy. And yet, if you're a Martian and you land on the Earth and you investigate, maybe first you look at the pages of the AHR for the last 25, 30 years, or maybe you look at the pages of the Journal of American History for the last 25, 30 years, 40 years. And then you look at the roster of leading history departments, or shall we say, research history departments in general. I think you as a Martian would be stunned to see how many departments, let's start with that, do not have somebody who's focused on this. And at least relatively speaking, how few articles in the premier journals in the discipline of history, on the U.S. side at least, recently have pieces that focus on some of the things that we talk about in this article.
So I guess you've been in the field now for some time. What is your explanation for that?
Well, I think my explanation, there are several reasons, I think, why this is going on. I think part of it is a very important salutary turn on the part of historians to studying social history from below, to give people in history who formerly were not getting a lot of scholarly attention, give them what they needed to have and what they have to have. And I think that's been really important for the profession. There's been, continues to be a kind of suspicion of power, studying power, a sense that if we do study the elites, that we're somehow apologists for those elites. I think that goes on. But I'm puzzled, Frank, by this on some level, because we all know when we attend dinner parties, which I hope we can do again soon. When we attend dinner parties, we talk constantly about the president. We talk constantly about this potential military intervention, or what's going to happen with North Korea, or is there going to be war with Iran? I think all of us do that, history department members. And yet, when it comes to research, to producing our books and our articles, something falls away, or at least too often it falls away. I'm probably putting things too starkly here for the purposes of this discussion, but there is a kind of disconnect in terms of our daily lives. This stuff really matters. If we open up the New York Times, if we look at the Washington Post and the Guardian, this stuff is everywhere, and it's critically important. I think what Danny and I are suggesting is that in addition to doing these really important things in transnational, international, cultural turn, we also need to pay attention to decision making and to foreign policy.
And could I add very briefly to Fred's comment? I also think there's just a practical problem, is that U.S. foreign relations history really does exist between two fields. So when you're a department and you're posting your Americanist job, it's unlikely that a U.S. foreign relations historian is going to get that job, because it really does straddle U.S. foreign policy and international history. And with the contraction of the job market generally, and with the contraction of history departments generally, I think you see U.S. foreign relations history as one of the first things that is not explicitly, but is implicitly cut out. I just know from being on the job market a lot in the last, let's say, 8 years, there's very, very few positions for just U.S. foreign relations history. Oftentimes they're American history with a focus in race or whatnot, but very few specifically in our subfield.
And the problem, in a way, I'm an optimistic guy by nature, as you know, Frank, but I'm coming across as a Cassandra here. But the problem, in a way, goes deeper, which is not only are there few positions in a terrible job market to begin with, let's be honest, it's terrible in all respects, but very few positions, as Danny says, that will yield a foreign relations historian. But the problem is deeper now. I'm not even sure that the pipeline, that is to say, the people who are in their middle years of their PhD program, who are getting their doctorate, who are deciding, or maybe they're a little earlier than this, so they're deciding on a dissertation topic. I'm not sure that they're producing the kinds of work that I think Danny and I would like to see more of, so that when they do go on the job market, they're even in a position to fill jobs of the type that we're talking about here. That's a concern of mine.
This is really interesting. Let me ask you, and Danny, I'm particularly interested in your view as an intellectual historian about the role of disciplines in the modern university. I say this as someone who's employed by Johns Hopkins University, which is really the place where the modern social science disciplines in the United States got their start. And we also recognize that we're at a moment where higher education, which was already under challenge in the social sciences and the humanities, we can imagine as the challenge is only going to increase post-COVID. And I look and I see the three of us, and I actually don't think any of us have our tenure homes in a history department. Fred, I know that you may have shifted part of your tenure to the history department, but that was not your original appointment. Our sponsor, Will Inboden, is not in a history department. My colleagues, Mary Cerati, Hal Brands, they're not in history departments. And one of the things I've thought about, and I wonder about your views, are the advantages and disadvantages of disciplines as a way of organizing the production of and dissemination of knowledge in the modern university. Part of me, I spent a lot of time when I was at MIT hanging out with nuclear engineers. They have a completely different view of these things. They say, what's the problem? They'll take people from computational science, physics, material sciences, biochemistry, and they're agnostic on the disciplinary training, whereas they judge people by identifying important problems and solving them. Now, I can imagine all sorts of problems with that. Engineering is not necessarily considered the way you should organize knowledge in universities, but I wonder if both of you have a reflection on disciplines broadly as a way of organizing universities and knowledge, and in particular, the history discipline, and whether or not the concern for history in the past has been helped or perhaps hindered by the discipline of history, which I consider different than sort of those who practice, teach, and study history. Does that make sense?
So I'll answer this as someone whose part of my professional work is to examine the history of interdisciplinarity. And in historical practice, it's very, very difficult for disciplines to meaningfully share across borders in terms of the tools and approaches that they use. I think there is a utility to interdisciplinary discussion in the sense that it opens up questions, it pushes you in particular directions, it enables you to consider things in new ways. But when you're actually talking about sharing the tools of scholarly practice across disciplinary boundaries, it's actually very difficult, because I do think there's fundamental epistemological and ontological differences between, say, the field I most know besides history, how IR scholars approach the world and how history scholars approach the world. IR scholars, in broad generality, even if they adopt archival methods and qualitative research methods, want to divine patterns across history to make large scale. I think they really do want to make predictions, but there's been a turn away from that because they've failed so many times. But I would say like the method is for the purpose of predicting where international relations is going to go. There's a predictive model. I think recently realists have tried to rebrand themselves as people who are saying how it should be as to how it is, because so many states don't abide by realist principles. But I think generally it's a prescriptive act. I don't think history is organized around predicting the future. I actually think history is more useful to policymakers for that very reason. I like history because the best you can do is say, you need wisdom in order to act meaningfully in the world. And you can gain wisdom by examining how things happened in the past, but when the existential moments when the policymaker has to make a decision, she or he has nothing to rely on but wisdom and judgment. And I think that modesty is embedded in history in a way that it isn't embedded in IR as traditionally constructed in the American Academy. Now, I think there are very contingent historical reasons, namely IR had to rebrand itself from a political theory in the early 1950s in the American Academy in order to gain funding and to gain a disciplinary space, but that's how it happened over time. So I think disciplines are very useful and interdisciplinary discussion is very useful, but I often find in the actually existing modern American Academy, it's sort of a hand-wavy gestures, like interdisciplinary discussion is good, capital G. No one really knows why, or no one really knows to what end. And that's been happening for about 60 years now. So that's a pattern embedded in the history of interdisciplinarity.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Danny. I would agree. When I was at Cornell and I was in a senior administrative position at Cornell, we talked a lot about interdisciplinarity and how we were going to break down the silos between departments at Cornell and schools at Cornell and get people to not only talk with each other but actually collaborate. I left while this project was still going on, but as far as I could see, not that much actually happened. I will also say to you both, and maybe this resonates with you, that I'm very glad to be in the Kennedy School, to be working alongside people. And I'm one of the few historians at the school, and we're a diminishing number, which is an interesting subject in and of itself. But I'm glad to be working alongside political scientists and economists and sociologists and philosophers. It's a very enriching experience. At the same time, they leave me scratching my head when we talk about promotion cases and it's about citation counts. I raise my hand and I say, well, we in history, we don't really do this, and it's not important in the same way it is for you. And I think they have a hard time judging historical work and how important it is. And so in those moments, I'm happy to have my joint appointment. And when I come to a history department faculty meeting, I sort of, okay, yeah, now I'm with people who understand, even if they don't do the kind of work that I do. And in fact, when I talk with Steve Walt at the Kennedy School, Steve and I can connect about our scholarly interests in a way that, frankly, I can't often do with my history colleagues. Nevertheless, I guess what I'm suggesting is that I'm glad I've got a foot in the history department in addition to the...
So but I guess I would follow up and ask in the same question when I was asking both of you, which I noticed both of you punted. You have to pick your 20, 40, or 60 and how... And again, recognizing what Danny said is absolutely right. It's going to reflect people's particular prejudices and projects, but I'm interested in the process. What is the right process, or the most fair, just, effective, good process that leads to something approaching the best 60? I would ask you, Fred, you were in administration for a while. You're a provost or you're a dean, and you have a certain amount of junior faculty positions, and you've got to hand them out to the economics department. You have to hand them to the political science department. You have to hand them out to other social science departments, and you're making the case. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is the extent to which, because both of you obviously wrote this piece with a lot of passion, what is the strategy both for helping sort of the diplomatic history, but also history writ large in that argument, and why has it developed the way it has? What is problematic about that process, and what would you change to make it better?
Well, I'll answer it in a practical way. I think that an argument that I would want to make to the dean at the particular college that is constructing this history department, and maybe if the department already exists, the argument that I would make to the chair of that department is that, if this were a market-driven discipline, which it ought to be at least to some extent, you will get kids in the seats. You will get butts in the seats. If, in addition to teaching lots of other important things, you teach about, for lack of a better word, great events and issues of war and peace, important developments in the political history of, let's say, the United States, if we're focusing on U.S. history. So I would want to make the argument to that dean or to that department chair that, in fact, students are quite conservative in the small c sense of the word. They're quite traditional in their course interest, and so you will actually get enrollments if you do this. In addition, I would make the argument that I made earlier, which is that for intellectual reasons, this is a subject that should be covered in this history department of 20 or 30 or 40 people. And the task, Frank, I think it's a hard case to make, because I do think that many people in the position to receive this message would be skeptical that this work that I'm talking about is cutting edge enough, is interesting enough, is fresh enough. But it's certainly the argument that I would try to make. I don't know if that begins to answer your question.
No, yeah. And so, but I'm interested in asking Danny, Fred's first part of his answer was a market-based answer. Do you ascribe to that?
I will, as a millennial, of course not. But I would say, in more seriousness, I would say for political and moral reasons, any history department in the United States should have at least one historian focusing on the effect U.S. power had on people abroad, and one historian focusing on the development of that power in the United States and how that power was imagined and utilized. I think the United States is the head of a globe-spanning empire, and it's incumbent for civic reasons to teach people who are educated at American colleges about the realities, practice, and development of this power. And I would add, if we're talking about market, definitely also include someone who focuses on the Nazis. In all of my experience in the American Academy, students love taking classes about Nazi Germany.
And let me just add, I think this is so important. I mean, the use of military history, the use of military force, rather, has such momentous consequences in so many areas. And I think our students, the next generation, need to be equipped to understand that power. I think it's incumbent, therefore, if I can get on my soapbox, I think we've got to train the next generation of college and university students, which is the next generation of our leadership, or at least a future generation of leadership, to understand where this power came from, how it's been used to make the United States the most powerful nation in the history of the world. And as Danny points out, also, whether it's the same person or somebody else, the effects, often negative effects, not always, but often negative effects, destructive effects of that power on other countries.
Fred, if I could ask you about that, I think both of you have demonstrated a commitment and an argument for engagement with the public square, even, God forbid I use the term policy relevance. But Danny mentioned something that's always interested me, the idea of his particular set of political commitments and the connection to his scholarship. And this is one of those areas where, and I think our IR friends are sometimes kidding themselves, but they would say, ooh, hold on a minute there. We're social scientists, right? And Barry Posen once gave me an answer to this, which I really liked, where he said, no one really takes the science part in political science seriously. It just keeps us honest. It reminds us of what we're at least trying to do. And so I want to hear from both of you, but Fred, I'll give you the first shot. What is the role of your particular political commitment, and how does it connect to your scholarship and teaching? Are they integrated? Are they separate? And is this part of the problem, part of the answer? This is obviously something within the field of history, certainly since the mid-'60s, has been a highly contested issue. How do you think about this issue?
Well, it's a really good question. And I think that there's a part of me, I'll answer for myself, there's a part of Fred Logevall who would like to keep my political commitments separate from my own scholarship, which is not to say that I think historians need to check their moral fervor at the door. Not at all. I think, in fact, in my early work, my dissertation on Kennedy and Johnson and the escalation of the war in Vietnam, I became deeply, I think, passionate about, I felt a kind of moral fervor as I got into the research. And as I saw the disconnect between what Johnson in particular and his aides were saying publicly about why they were doing what they were doing and what they were saying privately. And I could not get around the fact, I still can't get around the fact, and I would call it a fact, right? That Lyndon Johnson and later Richard Nixon, to some extent Kennedy also, expanded U.S. involvement in a conflict that they privately doubted was either winnable or necessary. And they sent 58,000 Americans, therefore, to die for a cause that they themselves didn't fully believe in. So that's not necessarily a political position, but I guess, in the partisan sense of political commitment, I do think it's important for us to, maybe I'm with Barry Posen on this, that, we need to keep ourselves honest. And I try to do that in my work. I think there's a regrettable belief on the part of our colleagues. This is something that Danny and I think, are responding to, that somehow the kind of argument that we're making comes from the right, that it's an argument from the political right, which, and I think we say this, if you know anything about Danny Bessner's work or Fred Logeval's work, it just doesn't work. It doesn't apply. I think in political terms, Danny's probably a little bit to my left, but I'm Swedish. I'm a social democrat. In American terms, that puts me certainly on the left side of the spectrum.
For instance, when is communism to your left? But I would say that in actuality, the first guiding light of my scholarship is historical empathy. Is that when I'm writing for a scholarly audience, I want to understand why people made the choices and decisions that they did, both in terms of individual agency and in terms of structure. However, I am of the opinion, and this really emerges from my work as an intellectual historian, that all of us are so historically situated that our politics necessarily informs our work, our values, what we think the world should look like, and things along those lines. So I am of the opinion that historians should be more explicit about their politics because, in a sense, that's their theory of how the world works, or at least how they think the world ought to work. I think that's a working theory, a working framework about how people interact in the world. So my ideal historian is both aware of their political commitments while also being fully historically empathetic in order to understand people in their own context. I think there's nothing so tedious as a historian judging people in the past for not being, for example, as woke as someone would be in 2020. However, what I've always thought interesting about this, there are certain lines that we can implicitly accept. For example, there's only so much empathy you're going to have for a Nazi or a slave owner, right? So there are things about our field that we implicitly say are on the other side of a moral boundary. And to me, that's always been an interesting question about where we as a field draw that moral boundary. But I do think that my politics necessarily informs my work. As I said in public, so it's not a big deal, I wanted Bernie Sanders to win the election. And I sent, memos to Bernie's campaign, whether they read them or not, I never know. But I was, a quote unquote foreign policy advisor to the Sanders campaign. And my politics emerged totally from my scholarship and ironically totally from the international turn. Growing up in the 1990s in the post-Cold War era, I was always told that, capitalism won. It's the end of history. It's going to provide for the most people in the most efficient way. And I think my experience, and I would say this is a generational experience, nothing but that constantly being disproved. First with the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, then with the 2008-2009 recession, and now more recently with the election of Trump and the global pandemic. So I think you're going to see, and you already have seen, more and more explicit politics amongst people of my, let's say, millennial generation, because I think the status quo has failed us so often and so repeatedly that you see an actual epistemological shift as to what's considered to produce good scholarship. So I think that Fred and I actually have a little bit of a generational difference here, just which reflects naturally and understandably our own different generational experiences. And to me, my major generational experience is being disappointed by the promises that I was promised in the 1990s.
But can I push you just a little bit on this, Danny, or at least I want clarification. Why we, Gavin, in your view, Gavin, Logeval, Bessner, why we should be explicit, why we should trumpet or at least articulate our political position. That seems to me. Well, I just worry that if that becomes a kind of lodestar, then your work is more likely to be tendentious. I think I don't know what it gets you. Could you? Maybe I missed something there, but I'd like to just know a little bit more about why you want the explicit political articulation.
No, I think that's a really great question for two reasons. One, people are going to try to divine it anyway. I think there are people in our field, who consider John Lewis Gaddis conservative or William Appleman Williams left wing or something along those lines. And I think it's a natural thing for scholars to do is to try to divine political intent. But perhaps more importantly, from a scholarly perspective, I do think politics is a theory of the world, and it necessarily informs how you decide what to focus on, what matters in your analysis. So my essential claim, which may very well be wrong, I'm still working this out, is that when historians are explicit about their politics, it actually prevents the sort of tendentiousness you rightly worry about, because it forces you to examine your own assumptions about how the world works. So I oftentimes think they're implicit, and they serve as an implicit theory, but by being more vocal about them, maybe not saying, I am on the left and this is what I think. But for example, I think American empire is a bad thing. Why is that? I think by being more explicit about those political values and those political decisions, we could actually work to make our scholarship less tendentious.
We could continue this. We are a bit over time, and I feel terrible as a host. I didn't do a very good job about talking about your outstanding, fascinating piece. So I'm going to give one final question. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen an H-Diplo roundtable on one article. And so I guess I'm very interested in your views on the reaction. Both, did you anticipate this reaction? What are your takeaways from the reaction? And finally, if you might say something briefly about your experience with Texas National Security Review and whether or not, as chairman of the Board of Editors, I'm always trying to get young historians to send their stuff in. So if you want to end with a plug for how awesome the experience was, you can do that too. So, Danny, I'll give you that, and then Fred, and then we'll sort of wrap up.
Sure. We definitely anticipated this reaction. And part of the reason that I anticipated this reaction, again, is because I'm an intellectual historian, and all historians have their identities wrapped up in their topic of approach and their topic of and their method effectively. And so I definitely anticipated that the piece was going to be read in a way that we didn't intend. And so I thought, Fred, you could disagree with me, but I thought we took special care to underline often and repeatedly that we were not saying that this is the only thing that historians should do in the field. And I do think that there was a little bit of misreading of the piece because people took us to be saying that, again, because their own identities are wrapped up in it, and that's completely understandable, and I completely empathize with that. But we didn't say that. But I'm not particularly surprised that that's how the piece was read. And we actually toned down language that, people read earlier drafts, they would have been like, whoa. But we toned down that language. I'm very glad that it's sparked discussion in the field. And I actually do want to trumpet the TNSR's response time. So, Fred, we could decide to cut this out if you think, but just to be completely honest, we initially submitted it to the AHR. And I think that we got very dismissive comments as a result, literally half a page. This is not interesting. This is not of interest to American to historians of all fields. This is both wrong and naive. And I thought pretty dismissive comments. Plus, it took about a year to do. So one thing that was great about working with the TNSR is that it was a very quick response time. We got, I thought, actually helpful comments that took our project for what it was and not what someone might have imagined it to be. And I thought that was a really good experience, particularly between time to submission and time to publication was very quick. And Fred, we could take that out about the HR if you think it's inappropriate, but I don't care personally.
I would say that we did anticipate that this thing would make a splash. I don't think we quite thought that Daniel Immerwahr would propose so quickly an HDIPLO roundtable, and that Diane Labrosse would so quickly say yes, so that the elapsed time between the publication of the article and the HDIPLO roundtable was, just lightning fast. There's
Diane
also
is great.
a paper passport roundtable on it. But I think as Danny said, we thought that this was a piece that needed to be written, and that it would get attention. And the AHR took a long time to make up its mind, and then they chose not to take it. And the Texas National Security Review, I just can't say enough about how professional the operation is in our judgment. And I'm on the board of editors, so I've had some sense of what's going on. But in terms of seeing it up close as an author, Doyle in particular did such a great job with this, and we got this thing out. Really quickly. I'll just say one other thing, and you can keep this in if you think it's interesting or not. But we got, in terms of responses to the piece, we got a response from a very senior member of the international relations field in political science. I won't name the person in case that's not the thing to do. But the person said, which I thought was pretty interesting, and I'm going to quote, "Much of your profession wants to have it both ways. The U.S. is the source of much or most of the ills of the world, but we've underestimated others' agency, and we need to look to them to understand what has happened. In this worldview," this person goes on, very eminent member of the IR field, "in this worldview, it sometimes seems that any good results are attributed to the wisdom and actions of others, but that the bad is the fault of the United States. In parallel, while attacking theories of American exceptionalism, they also often imply, if not to say, that the U.S. is unique in much of its unpleasant behavior, a view that is, as a part-time realist," okay, I'm giving a clue here, I would find odd, especially for those who presumably study international history. I mention this, Frank, because I think it's a very interesting insight, a response to I think the article, also a response to the HDIPLO roundtable, and I think goes to something that Danny and I also felt early on, and was something that we wanted to respond to. And judging by the reaction, at least we got people talking.
Well, it was a terrific piece. It generated fantastic debate and discussion, which is always the sign of great scholarship. And let me thank both of you for joining us here on a Saturday afternoon. This was a lot of fun. And for all those younger scholars out there, please send your best work to Texas National Security Review. We'd love to see all the best new historical work. And thank you, Fred and Danny, for joining us. This was terrific.
Pleasure,
Thanks
Frank.
very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.